With 36.9% of the vote share, the Conservative Party has been re-elected in the UK, this time as sole governing party. This will give the party the power to steer the UK's foreign policy their way. At a recent Black Coffee morning event at our London offices, experts analysed what these results will mean for Britain's membership in the EU and the development of the EU going forward.
The way the Conservative Party will be moving over the next year would be to support the Prime Minister's renegotiation. And that renegotiation is very much based on his Bloomberg speech, his migration speech, and his desire for a treaty change. If the Prime Minister can get those three things, which I firmly believe he can and will, then the Conservative Party will back him. The Conservative Party clearly needs to be wooed. And the way to woo it is to make sure that the Prime Minister can say, this is what I promised, this is what I've got, now I need to deliver it. And also I need Britain to stay in a European Union as a whole united country. In order to do that, we have to bring the Scots on board, and so consequently we need to have a much more positive, bigger picture about how Britain sees its place in Europe in the future. That's the way they will be brought on sale.
So the first thing that the Conservative government will do now is go to Brussels and try and renegotiate, get a new settlement for Britain in Europe. That will probably focus on a few key issues, those issues having to do with benefits for migrants, EU migrants coming to the UK, to do with the power of national parliaments, to do with Britain's powers, or non-Eurozone members' powers within the European Union, and issues such as that, and get some kind of resettlement, renegotiations for Britain within the European Union. Now, it's unlikely to be treaty change, although David Cameron has talked about treaty change. Simply the timing of it looks impossible to get that before 2017, when the referendum should happen. But also there's not a lot of appetite for treaty change in other European member states.
What we've seen in the early days is that the team who's going to be driving this process will be led by George Osborne, with Philip Hammond in the Foreign Office. And as far as the renegotiation is concerned, I think there are going to be lots of demands for a more liberal, competitive, free trade Europe with a deeper single market. But there'll be four sets of tricky issues which Cameron is going to need to negotiate with other member states. The most politically salient one is to do with migration, and particularly the rules for in-work and out-of-work benefits, which he will want to change to make sure that people have to live here for a few years before they get access to them. Second set of issues is to do with the relationship between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone members, to make sure that the Eurozone doesn't caucus and then impose things on the non-Eurozone. Thirdly is the question of national parliaments and whether they should have more of a role in blocking EU proposals that they don't like. They want to introduce a red card procedure where if 40% of parliaments don't like EU measures, they can get them blocked. And finally, a more symbolic question about ever closer union and whether that can somehow be removed or redescribed in the treaties.
An EU referendum will be held, and it might be sooner than expected.
The most important thing to realise is he's got to get the tough stuff out of the way as soon as possible. And the tough stuff is, of course, the European referendum. And the tough stuff is dealing with the economy. So whilst people will increasingly, no doubt, be more sceptical of the government's achievements, as sure as eggs, this happens, the most important thing for the Prime Minister to do is to get the tough stuff out of the way as soon as possible, and then I think he will mitigate any opposition to him. The public are effectively going to be very risk-averse to anything that prejudices the jobs and the growth that have been created in this country. And so the truth is, the big argument will be whether Europe helps or hinders that job creation. So that's very important to know.
It looks most likely that the leadership of the Conservative Party will campaign to stay in the European Union. However, it's likely to be a split party that goes to the polls. In other words, there are quite a few backbenchers who, no matter what David Cameron comes back with from Brussels, will campaign to leave the European Union. So it will not be a sort of uniform campaign to stay in. However, the major opposition party, the Labour Party, will most likely, the leadership there will also, of course, campaign to stay in. So there will be a large majority in the House of Commons that will go out and campaign for continued British membership of the European Union. Nonetheless, I would say that a yes vote to stay in the European Union is more likely. It's more likely because the risks associated with leaving the European Union are great, and they're perceived to be great by the majority, I would think, of a British electorate.
It seems pretty clear that the rest of the EU does not want to have a major intergovernmental conference and a constitutional convention and a wholesale rewriting of the treaties. But Cameron has now gone on the record and said that he needs to get treaty change. So one of the interesting questions are going to be how they square that particular circle. And some people have talked about maybe having a legally binding protocol which lays out some of the things which other member states agree to, which would then be implemented in the next round of major treaty change. That could be a compromise that works, but it could also be writing a problem which could blow up in the British government's face in the future if, for example, the new treaty never happens. The Eurosceptics will be able to say that the promises which have been made are not realised. So that's the agenda in the first few days. We're going to see whether that will satisfy David Cameron's party and whether he will be able to bring it through the House of Commons. And then there'll be big questions about the referendum campaign and how it's fought. But we expect to see a formal process launched around the June Council meeting, and the weeks between now and then we'll see a lot of shuttle diplomacy, I think, between London and different capitals to see whether there can be a majority found in favour of those sorts of issues.